I won't marry him. I am not your bargaining chip. That was the moment Whitney Morgan shattered every expectation placed on her and got slapped across the face by her mother in front of two families. What do you think happened next? Did she come back or rise beyond every limit they tried to set? Let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And before we dive into this jaw-dropping true story of betrayal, courage, and a comeback no one saw coming, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future real-life transformations. This isn't just a story about rejecting an arranged marriage. It's about choosing freedom over tradition, breaking cycles, and returning home on her jet. From being thrown out into the rain with nothing but a backpack to building an empire on her terms. Stay until the end because you'll want to see the moment she stands face to face with the parents who disowned her, and what she says will leave you speechless. From the outside, the Morgan home looked like something out of a Southern lifestyle magazine. White columns, manicured hedges, black shutters polished to a shine. Neighbors often paused to admire the hydrangeas or compliment Celeste Morgan's taste in seasonal wreaths. Inside, however, the air was thick with unspoken rules and the constant weight of appearances. Whitney Morgan, the only child of Pastor Marcus Morgan and his formidable wife, Celeste, had grown up under crystal chandeliers in the heavy shadow of perfection. There was no room for chaos, no tolerance for flaws. Every smile had to be camera-ready, every step choreographed, every thought filtered through what her mother would call a lady's decorum. Celeste Morgan was the kind of woman who commanded a room without raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her disapproval came with a tilt of the head, a pursed lip, a perfectly timed silence that could slice deeper than words. At dinner, she'd correct Whitney's posture mid-bite with a glance, and Whitney would straighten her spine instinctively. She was trained like a show pony, always dressed in pastels, hair pressed into silky obedience, and nails shaped just so. But beneath the polished surface, a quiet storm was brewing, one that Celeste either refused to see or believed she could suppress like she always had. Whitney's father, Pastor Marcus, was a gentler presence, tall and soft-spoken, with eyes that often flicked downward when things got tense. He was well respected in the community, known for his sermons on forgiveness and humility, yet he rarely practiced either when it came to his daughter. He loved Whitney in his distant way, but he deferred to Celeste in all matters of the home. When Celeste made a decision, it became law, and no one, especially not an 18-year-old girl, dared question it. If Whitney ever looked to her father for backup, all she received in return was a slight shake of the head or a whispered, "Just listen to your mother." But Whitney was tired of listening. She had dreams that extended far beyond the church pews and charity luncheons her mother had planned for her. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit under her covers with her laptop, browsing business schools, comparing programs, imagining a future where she wore heels because she wanted to, not because her mother laid them out. She had a list of goals hidden in a box beneath her bed. Start her own business, live in a city with real seasons, travel somewhere where no one knew her last name. But she knew better than to speak these thoughts aloud, not in a house where ambition was only encouraged in the men. Celeste had her vision for Whitney's future, one that had nothing to do with business plans or self-empowerment. It was a future built on the legacy of Southern tradition, on the belief that a young woman's greatest achievement was marrying well. And Celeste believed she had found the perfect match in Thomas Blake, a 50-year-old white businessman, widowed, wealthy, and deeply connected to the church board. He was everything Celeste admired, well-dressed, well-mannered, and most importantly, impressed by her daughter's beauty and poise. He had approached Pastor Marcus after a Sunday service with a subtle proposal, and Marcus, after a single glance at his wife, had nodded his approval. The deal was as good as done. Whitney first met Thomas over dinner at a steakhouse she didn't choose, wearing a dress she didn't like, sipping from a glass of sparkling water she didn't order. He smiled at her like she was an auction prize, complimenting her skin, her posture, her exquisite manners, all while looking her up and down like he was assessing a stock portfolio. His hand grazed her shoulder as he leaned in to speak, and Whitney had to suppress the shudder that rippled through her. Celeste beamed from across the table, completely oblivious or perhaps entirely aware of her daughter's discomfort. Marcus said little, sipping his iced tea and nodding occasionally as Thomas listed his favorite golf courses and travel destinations. That night, Whitney stared at her ceiling in the dark, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. It wasn't love, not even close. It was a transaction. She was the currency, and her parents were eager to close the deal. Her Berkeley acceptance letter lay tucked between the pages of an old biology textbook on her shelf, the golden escape she had worked for in silence. But that future was at risk now. Celeste was planning something, and Whitney could feel it in the way her mother had started calling Thomas Tom, in the way she had booked a hair appointment for Whitney without asking, in the way she had smiled too long over a dinner Whitney hadn't agreed to. Then came the invitation, a formal dinner at the Morgan residence, family only. Celeste insisted Whitney wear her pale lavender gown, the one that made her look like a Southern debutante. She curled Whitney's hair herself, humming gospel under her breath, eyes gleaming with excitement. "You'll understand one day," Celeste said as she adjusted the pearl earrings on Whitney's lobes. "All I've done, everything I've sacrificed, it's for you." Whitney bit back the urge to scream. It wasn't for her. None of it had ever been for her. It was for control, for image, for the illusion of a perfect life. As she descended the staircase into the candlelit dining room, Whitney knew what was coming. The long table was set with the good china. Thomas stood at the head of it, smiling like a man already assured of his prize. Her parents flanked him, beaming like proud sellers. And in that moment, as Whitney took her place at the table, every part of her wanted to run. But instead she sat, calm and still, her back straight, her face unreadable. Because Whitney Morgan wasn't going to run. Not yet. The dinner began like a meticulously rehearsed performance. Crystal stemware gleamed under the chandelier, flickering candlelight casting golden halos on the polished mahogany table. Celeste had outdone herself. Linen napkins folded into roses, silverware aligned with military precision, and a three-course meal prepared by a local caterer, but passed off as her own. Whitney sat at the far end of the table in the lavender gown, her back straight, hands resting quietly in her lap, and heart pounding like a trapped drum beneath her ribs. Thomas Blake, seated beside her, smelled of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. His laugh echoed too loudly, his comments bordered on patronizing, and his hand kept drifting too close to hers. Across the table, Celeste was glowing like a bride's mother, while Marcus kept his gaze on his plate, chewing slowly and avoiding Whitney's eyes altogether. The dinner conversation meandered through safe territory, church events, local politics, and real estate. But under the surface, tension rippled like a hairline crack in glass. Every now and then, Thomas would drop phrases like, "our future," or "when Whitney and I travel," and Celeste would smile so widely her cheekbones ached. Whitney chewed in silence, the food turning to ash in her mouth, her mind calculating escape routes even as her body sat frozen. Every time Thomas brushed her arm or looked at her with that smug, assured smirk, her throat tightened. She wasn't a daughter tonight, not even a person. She was currency, leverage in a social transaction, and the price had already been agreed upon, just not by her. Dessert came, a lemon tart delicately plated with raspberries. Celeste nodded discreetly to Thomas, who cleared his throat and stood. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box, placing it on the table with the solemnity of a man proposing peace after war. "Whitney," he began, his voice syrupy and confident, "these past few months have been illuminating. You are poised, elegant, and possess the grace of a woman twice your age. It would be the greatest honor of my life if you would become my wife." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring so large it might have needed its own chair at the table. There was a pause, a beat of silence thick enough to drown in. Celeste's eyes gleamed, her lips parted in breathless anticipation. Marcus looked up for the first time all evening, the air tightened, expectant. Whitney stared at the ring, then looked up at Thomas, whose face carried no trace of nervousness, only entitlement. Her gaze flicked to her mother, whose smile was already victorious, and then to her father, who looked as if he wanted to be anywhere else. In that moment, something in her snapped, not with fury, but with clarity, like a window shattering in perfect silence. "No," she said, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut porcelain. "I won't marry him." The world didn't end, but the air did disappear. Celeste blinked as if slapped herself. Thomas's smile wavered for the first time, and Marcus dropped his fork with a quiet clatter. Whitney rose from her seat slowly, as if every movement carried meaning. "I'm not a business deal. I'm not a pawn in your social ambitions. I'm a human being, and I have dreams that don't involve becoming a trophy wife to a man older than my father." Thomas stood, stunned, as Celeste rose like a wave about to break. "Whitney Elise Morgan, sit down this instant," she hissed, her composure unraveling thread by thread. Whitney shook her head, her pulse racing. "I've had enough of pretending. I applied to business schools. I got accepted. I'm leaving, with or without your blessing." Her voice didn't tremble. It rang. Then came the slap, fast, loud, and sharp, like a thunderclap. Celeste's hand struck Whitney's cheek with such force that the room gasped. Marcus didn't move. Thomas muttered something under his breath and stepped back. His ego bruised more than his pride. Whitney's face burned, the sting laced with humiliation. But she didn't cry. She stood there, head high, the red mark blooming across her cheek like a badge of defiance. Her silence was louder than any scream. "Get out," Celeste whispered, her voice a cold blade. "If you walk away from this, you walk away from everything. Don't bother coming back. You are no daughter of mine." Whitney looked at Marcus, desperate for something. Support, a flicker of courage, anything, but he just lowered his eyes. "You heard your mother," he murmured, almost to himself, and with that, the sentence was sealed. The deal is broken. She didn't pack a suitcase. There was no dramatic dash up the stairs. She simply walked to the foyer, grabbed her worn backpack from the bench, and stepped outside. The night air hit her like a baptism, cold and liberating. Rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, soaking the satin gown, smearing her makeup, washing away years of silence in streaks of black and salt. She didn't look back. Not when the door slammed behind her. Not when the porch light flicked off. Not even when her phone buzzed in her pocket and she saw Tanya's name flash across the screen. "Come get me," she said into the phone. "I'm done." She stood there, drenched, burning, alive. Whitney Morgan had been erased from the Morgan legacy that night, disowned and discarded like a shameful secret. But for the first time in her life, she felt like her own person. She had nothing left, which meant, for the first time, she had everything to gain. The rain had soaked through every layer of Whitney's clothes by the time Tanya pulled up to the curb, her old silver Honda coughing smoke as it came to a stop. The passenger door creaked open, and without a word, Whitney slid in, dripping onto the cracked leather seat. Tanya didn't ask questions right away. She just reached into the back seat, pulled out an old towel, and tossed it over. The smell of fast food and cheap air freshener filled the car, and for once, Whitney found comfort in the chaos. They drove in silence for several minutes, the windshield wipers squeaking rhythmically as they pushed away the downpour. Finally, Tanya spoke, her voice soft but steady. "So, what happened?" Whitney exhaled, slow and heavy, then whispered, "Everything." Tanya lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous. There were stains on the carpet. The faucet in the bathroom dripped nonstop, and the fridge made a low humming noise that kept her up at night. But it was safe. Whitney slept on the pull-out couch, wrapped in a mismatched quilt, her backpack clutched like a lifeline. She couldn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. There was too much weight pressing on her chest, too much noise in her head. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's hand swinging through the air, saw the disappointment in her father's eyes, felt the cold finality of the door closing behind her. But beneath the pain, a tiny ember burned, a stubborn flicker of resolve that refused to die. The next morning, Whitney rose early, still wearing the same damp clothes. Tanya had left a note on the counter and a bus schedule beneath it. "Go get that future you talked about," it read, and so she did. She rode 2 buses across town, walked 6 blocks in the drizzle, and stood in line at the community college admissions office with nothing but a crumpled acceptance letter and her high school transcript. She told the registrar her story with no embellishment, just truth, raw and unvarnished. The woman behind the desk nodded solemnly and said, "Let's see what we can do." That afternoon, Whitney was enrolled in 2 night classes, Introduction to Business and College Writing 101. It wasn't Berkeley, but it was something, a start. To afford textbooks and tuition, she took the first job she could find, working the register at a 24-hour diner off the freeway. The uniform was 2 sizes too big and smelled faintly of syrup and cigarettes, and her manager, a weary woman named Claudine, barked orders like a drill sergeant. But Whitney never complained. She memorized the menu within a week, learned to smile through exhaustion, and became a favorite among the truckers who tipped generously for her politeness. After shifts that ended at 3 a.m., she'd walk home under flickering streetlights, her feet blistered and her eyes burning, but her heart still holding steady. On weekends, she babysat for Tanya's neighbors and filled out scholarship applications in between loads of laundry. Most went unanswered. One rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday evening while she was eating instant noodles in front of the TV. It was a full-ride scholarship she'd dared to hope for, and when she opened the thin envelope and read the words, "We regret to inform you," it felt like a punch to the ribs. She stared at the page for a long time, wondering if this was the sign she should just go back, apologize, and surrender. But then Tanya walked in, saw the letter, and said, "That's just one no. You faced worse." And somehow that was enough. The days bled into weeks. Whitney's world was a loop of lectures, late shifts, bills, and borrowed textbooks. Her apartment moved from Tanya's couch to a tiny studio above a nail salon. It had peeling paint, one working burner on the stove, and a shower that only ran cold, but it was hers. She bought a futon from a thrift store, used cardboard boxes as makeshift tables, and called it home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and every cent of rent was paid by her own hands. She'd tape motivational quotes to the fridge, write goals on sticky notes, and tell herself, "One more month, just keep going." It was during one of her early morning shifts at a rundown coffee shop that everything changed. She had spilled a caramel macchiato on a customer's designer bag, one of those sleek types who looked wildly out of place in the gray-tiled gloom of the shop. Whitney apologized profusely, offered to comp her drink, and even cleaned the bag with napkins and gentle panic. The woman, to her surprise, didn't yell. Instead, she watched Whitney with an amused expression and asked, "Rough night?" Whitney laughed, more out of exhaustion than amusement, and said, "Rough few years." The woman smiled and handed over a business card. "I'm Carolyn Jameson. I run the marketing department over at JDX Consulting. We're looking for someone who thinks fast. You interested?" Whitney stared at the card long after Carolyn left, her hands trembling. That night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror holding the card, mouthing the company name like it was a spell. She had been invisible for so long, buried under debt, pain, and disappointment. But here was something, an opening, a crack of light in the darkness, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. When she walked into JDX for her interview 3 days later, she wore her best clothes, clean jeans, a tucked-in blouse, and shoes she'd scrubbed with an old toothbrush. She didn't have a polished resume, but she had hustle, honesty, and scars that had taught her more than any internship. Carolyn barely glanced at her file before saying, "The position's entry level, phones, filing, maybe some copy work. But if you're hungry, there's room to grow." Whitney didn't hesitate. "I'm starving," she said, and with that, the door opened. Not to everything she wanted, but to the chance to earn it. Not through connections or control, but through work, grit, and the undeniable fact that she had already survived worse than failure. Whitney Morgan had nothing, and that was exactly what made her dangerous. The office at JDX Consulting wasn't glamorous, but to Whitney, it looked like the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. Gray carpets, fluorescent lights, and rows of cubicles didn't matter because she had a badge. Her name, printed on laminated plastic, hung from a clip on her hip like a small miracle. Her desk was nestled between the copier and the kitchenette, and her job was to answer phones, file reports, and schedule meetings she wasn't invited to. But every morning she arrived early, and every night she stayed late, because even from the bottom of the ladder, she could already see the next rung. Her first few weeks were brutal. Carolyn was kind, but she didn't hold hands. "Figure it out" became a mantra Whitney whispered under her breath every time she was assigned something she didn't understand, like formatting reports for client pitches or navigating the nightmare of scheduling three executives who hated each other. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but she never made the same one twice. When others clocked out at 5, Whitney stayed behind to watch YouTube tutorials on marketing analytics and client engagement strategies. While her coworkers chatted over lunch, she jotted ideas for brand refreshes and read case studies like they were treasure maps. Whitney noticed things others didn't. She saw how the company's social media presence was dull and inconsistent, how their website looked like it hadn't been touched since the early 2000s, and how clients often seemed confused about what JDX offered. So one weekend, while her classmates went out drinking, she locked herself in her apartment with takeout and ambition and built a mock campaign for a fictional client. She crafted brand messaging, content calendars, and a sample social media strategy, then printed everything out, slid it into a plastic folder, and nervously handed it to Carolyn on a Monday morning. Carolyn raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the pages, her fingers pausing on the digital mock-ups and tailored captions. "You did this over the weekend?" she asked, and Whitney nodded, clutching her coffee cup to steady her hands. "No one asked you to," Carolyn said, but there was something new in her voice: interest. She set the folder down and looked Whitney dead in the eye. "You've got instincts. Don't waste them answering phones forever." That single sentence lit a fuse under Whitney's feet. From that day on, she poured every spare second into marketing, not just the tasks assigned to her, but the deeper mechanics behind them. She volunteered to take notes in strategy meetings just to listen. She offered to help junior associates with their presentations so she could study their slides. She started an internal newsletter recapping trends and analytics from JDX's social data, which Carolyn secretly forwarded to the higher-ups. And slowly, the whisper of her name started to float around the office, not as the girl who answers phones, but as the one with the ideas. When a senior account manager botched a client pitch and had a meltdown the night before a major presentation, Whitney stepped in without being asked. She stayed until midnight, reworking the slide deck, tweaking visuals and rewriting taglines based on everything she'd quietly absorbed over the last 6 months. The next day, Carolyn brought her into the boardroom and said, "Sit in. If this works, it's yours as much as his." Whitney sat in the corner, silent and steady as the campaign was unveiled. And when the client clapped at the end, she felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with pride. Her first official promotion came a month later, along with a real desk, a salary she could almost breathe on, and a new title, Junior Marketing Associate. It wasn't the corner office, but it was no longer beside the coffee machine, and that alone felt like a victory. She could finally quit her diner job, cutting her work week from 70 hours to 60. With the extra time, she re-enrolled in her business degree program full-time, transferring her community college credits and opting for night and weekend classes so she could juggle both worlds. There were nights she collapsed on her futon, too tired to even eat. Nights she cried in the shower with her shoes still on. Nights she questioned everything. But when she crossed small milestones, like getting her first client testimonial or scoring a perfect grade on a midterm, she celebrated in tiny ways. A better pair of shoes, a new plant for her desk, a dinner that didn't come from a microwave. These victories weren't loud, but they were hers, and she stacked them like bricks to build the foundation of a life she was finally beginning to believe in. Carolyn remained more than a boss. She became a quiet force behind Whitney's ascent. She pushed her, critiqued her work with surgical precision, and refused to let her coast. "You're better than that," she'd say, when Whitney handed in something just good enough. And Whitney, who had once wilted under her mother's perfectionism, found something healing in Carolyn's expectations, because they came from belief, not control. One Friday evening, after closing a difficult campaign that had almost cost them a key account, Carolyn invited Whitney out for dinner. Over wine and steak, she slid a sealed envelope across the table. Don't open it now, she said. But know this, there's more in you than JDX can hold. Whitney nodded, too stunned to speak, and walked home with the envelope clutched tight against her chest. She didn't open it until morning. Inside was a handwritten letter and a certified check for $100,000. At the bottom, scrawled in Carolyn's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Seed money, 15% equity. Go build something that scares you." Whitney stared at the check for a long time, her hands trembling with the weight of possibility. She wasn't ready, she wasn't sure. But somewhere deep inside, a voice she hadn't heard since she was a child whispered something fierce. Do it anyway. Whitney didn't sleep the night she received Carolyn's check. She sat at her small kitchen table, the letter open beside her, the check resting atop a stack of business plans she had scribbled and revised 100 times. The number stared at her like a dare. $100,000. It was more money than she'd ever seen in one place, yet it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a challenge, like Carolyn had handed her not freedom, but the keys to a cage of greater responsibility. And Whitney, heart pounding and mind racing, whispered to the silence of her apartment, "I'm not going to waste it." She named the company WM Strategies, not just for her initials, but for what it stood for in her mind: will manifested. She rented a tiny office in a converted industrial building with exposed brick, creaky floors, and windows that rattled in the wind. There was barely enough space for a desk, 2 chairs, and a used printer she found on Craigslist, but it was hers. No inherited legacy, no mother's approval, just grit, purpose, and a laptop that wheezed under pressure. She started with local clients, small businesses struggling to modernize, mom-and-pop shops bleeding customers to chains, people who didn't understand hashtags but knew survival was at stake. Her pitch was simple. You don't need flashy, you need to be effective. And people listened. Because Whitney didn't talk at them, she listened first. She asked questions no one else bothered to. She offered honest solutions, even when it meant walking away from a contract that wasn't a fit. That earned her something more valuable than money: trust. And in the world of small business, trust spreads fast. Her first campaign, for a struggling bakery, tripled their foot traffic in a month. The owner cried, hugged her in front of a crowd, and told everyone at church the next morning. The referrals flooded in. Within a year, Whitney hired her first employee, a fresh graduate named Elise, who reminded her too much of herself. Ambitious, exhausted, hungry for a chance. Then came a copywriter, a digital strategist, and a bookkeeper who doubled as a therapist during tight cash flow months. They moved into a bigger office. Nothing fancy, but it had doors that didn't stick and heat that worked in winter. Whitney still did everything, from leading strategy meetings to scrubbing coffee stains off the break room floor. But she had a team, and that meant everything. She met Andrew Carter during a pitch meeting for a client she almost didn't pursue. He owned a growing chain of eco-conscious home goods stores and had a reputation for being precise, demanding, and quietly brilliant. Whitney walked into the meeting expecting another numbers-obsessed CEO. What she got was a man who asked about her philosophy before her projections. He sat across the table, arms crossed, and said, "What do you actually believe marketing is?" Whitney leaned forward without missing a beat and replied, "It's not about selling. It's about storytelling that earns trust." He smiled at that, a small one, but it reached his eyes. Their business relationship blossomed first. She rebranded his product line, helped him expand into new markets, and restructured his online strategy. He sent thank you notes after every successful launch, hand-signed and personalized. One evening, after a long project presentation, they ended up eating takeout Thai food in a quiet corner of her office. They talked about everything: cities they wanted to visit, books they never finished, the fear of letting people down. Andrew didn't interrupt, didn't mansplain, didn't flinch at her ambition. He admired it. Their first kiss was hesitant but electric, like 2 storms finally crossing paths. Whitney wasn't sure she could trust it. Not after everything she had seen growing up, not after the shame and control she had fled. But Andrew never pushed. He showed up when he said he would. He celebrated her wins, didn't shrink in her shadow, and never once implied that she should slow down. When he proposed, it wasn't over champagne or under fireworks. It was a quiet Tuesday night, standing in the kitchen in pajamas, holding a simple silver band. "I don't want to own you," he said. "I want to build with you." They married in a small ceremony under a canopy of oak trees, with no family from Whitney's side in attendance. Carolyn was her matron of honor. Elise cried during the vows. Tanya flew in, danced barefoot, and whispered, "You did this, Whit. You made it real." They honeymooned in Vancouver for a weekend, then jumped back into work like nothing had changed, except everything had. They lived in a cozy townhouse near her new office. It had squeaky stairs, crooked pictures on the walls, and more laughter than Whitney had ever known in one home. Then came the unexpected curve, the test she hadn't planned for. She stared at the pregnancy test in disbelief, sitting on the closed toilet lid, hands trembling. Andrew found her there, the door slightly ajar, and when she showed him the test, he didn't ask if it was the right time. He just kneeled beside her and said, "Whatever you need, we'll figure it out." That night, as they lay awake, Whitney whispered her greatest fear. "What if I become her? What if I try to control too much?" Andrew kissed her forehead and replied, "Then we'll talk about it. We'll do better. That's the whole point, isn't it? To do better?" When Luna was born, Whitney held her in the dim hospital light, skin to skin, tears streaming down her cheeks. The baby was small, with a surprisingly loud cry, in her father's green eyes. Whitney pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and made a vow, not just to love her, but to see her, to let her choose, to never confuse obedience with worth. She took 6 weeks off, brought Luna to the office in a carrier sling, and converted the supply closet into a nursery. Her team didn't blink. They adapted. Elise took more responsibility. Andrew adjusted his schedule. The business kept growing. By Luna's second birthday, WM Strategies had opened its second office in Chicago. Whitney, once a girl with nothing but a backpack and bruised pride, was now a CEO, a wife, and a mother. And though she still carried the ache of her past like a scar under the skin, it no longer defined her. Her strength wasn't in escaping what had been done to her. It was in refusing to let it shape what she would become. And as she watched Luna take her first shaky steps across their living room floor, Whitney smiled to herself. The next generation wouldn't just inherit her legacy, they'd inherit her freedom. Luna was 5 the first time she asked Whitney why she didn't have grandparents like the other kids at preschool. It came out casually, in between bites of macaroni and cheese, as if she were asking why the sky was blue or why dogs bark. Whitney froze, her fork hovering in midair, the sound of the question louder than any scream. She looked across the table at Andrew, whose eyes met hers with the same quiet recognition. The moment had arrived. Whitney offered the only truth her daughter could understand, that sometimes grown-ups need space from each other to learn how to be better. Luna accepted it with a shrug, unconcerned, and moved on to the next question about dessert. But Whitney couldn't move on. Not that night. Not after years of carefully avoiding the subject like it was a live wire. Later, after Luna had fallen asleep in a pile of stuffed animals, Whitney sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, scrolling through old photos she hadn't looked at in years. Her mother's flawless smile stared back from charity event clippings, her father's somber face still framed by his signature horn-rimmed glasses. Their home appeared in the background of a local news interview, a colonial shell, pristine and timeless, as if her absence had never happened. Whitney felt something twist inside her, a mix of old anger and new ache. She had built an empire, created a life that sparkled with meaning and self-worth, but the silence from her parents had never changed. Not a single call, not a single word. She told herself she was over it. She told herself that some wounds don't get closure, they just get covered. But then an email arrived late one night from a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in a decade. The subject line was innocuous. Thought you should know. Inside was one line that detonated like a bomb. Your father had emergency heart surgery. He's recovering, but it was serious. There was no ask, no invitation, no plea for reconciliation, just information dropped into her inbox like an afterthought. Whitney stared at it for a long time, her hands numb and her breath shallow. Andrew found her on the patio an hour later, glass of untouched wine in hand, staring at nothing. She told him everything about the email, about Luna's question, about the ache she had buried so deep it had calcified into resentment. He didn't rush to comfort her, didn't tell her what to do. Instead, he said, "Do you want them to meet her?" It was the simplest question, but it split Whitney open. Because yes, she did. Not for them, not even for herself, but for Luna, who deserved the chance to know where she came from, even if the people waiting on the other side of that door didn't deserve the right to be called family. A week later, during a strategy meeting at her Chicago office, her head of operations presented potential cities for WM Strategy's third location. Among the contenders was her hometown, its economic forecast strong, its marketing needs untapped, its real estate affordable. The numbers made sense, but what truly sealed the decision wasn't on the spreadsheet. It was the look in Luna's eyes when she asked again, gently this time, "Do you think my grandma would like my drawings?" Whitney smiled and nodded, heart twisting, and knew what she had to do. She didn't announce her return. There would be no warning, no build-up, no chance for anyone to craft a performance. She wanted their raw reaction, unscripted and unfiltered. It wasn't revenge, at least not entirely. It was clarity. She needed to see their faces when she stepped off that plane, needed to watch their expressions as they realized what she had built without them. Whitney booked the company's jet, a sleek, compact Cessna that was both practical and symbolic. It wasn't opulent, but it was hers. And when it lifted off the tarmac with Luna's delighted squeals echoing through the cabin, Whitney felt both terrified and free. The descent into her hometown was surreal. The landscape was unchanged. Rolling hills, modest suburbs. The same river that snaked through the center like a ribbon of memory. Whitney looked out the window and saw her younger self walking those sidewalks, dreaming of escape. Now she was coming back, not as the obedient daughter they had tried to sculpt, but as a woman who had written her storyline line by line. As the wheels touched down, her stomach twisted with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't peace either. At the car rental lot, a sleek black SUV waited with her name on the reservation. Luna skipped to the back seat, still buzzing with excitement. Whitney drove slowly through familiar streets that now looked smaller, more faded, like a childhood toy held up under adult scrutiny. Her childhood home came into view around a bend in the road. The once pristine lawn was patchy, the hedges overgrown, and the paint on the shutters peeled in quiet surrender to time. It looked tired, like the people inside it. Whitney parked at the curb and sat still, gripping the steering wheel as Luna's voice chirped from the back. "Is this where you grew up, Mommy?" She turned around, smiled gently, and nodded. "Yes, baby, from when I was your age until I left." "It's pretty," Luna declared, her voice full of innocent acceptance. Whitney reached for the door handle, pausing to steady her breath. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but none of them had prepared her for the storm churning in her chest. She opened the door, stepped out into the crisp air, and walked with Luna up the familiar stone path. Each step echoed with ghosts of piano recitals, of slammed doors, of whispered arguments behind closed walls. She rang the bell. The same chime echoed from within, its melody unchanged. Her pulse raced. The door opened, and there stood her father, older, thinner, a cardigan swallowing his frame, eyes wide in disbelief. "Whitney," he whispered as if saying her name summoned a ghost. She met his gaze not with anger, but with unwavering calm. She tilted her head and said, "I thought it was time you met your granddaughter." The silence between them cracked like ice under pressure. Whitney reached down and gently urged Luna forward. "Luna, this is your grandpa Robert." From inside the house, another voice called out, one Whitney hadn't heard in years but could recognize even in her sleep. "Robert, who's at the door?" Her mother's silhouette appeared in the hallway, frozen in mid-step. The past, the pain, the silence, it all collided in that moment. Whitney smiled softly, her voice clear as glass. "Hi, Mom." The silence that followed Whitney's greeting was dense enough to drown in. Her mother didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared, one hand resting on the polished banister as if to steady herself. Her once impeccable hairstyle looked slightly disheveled, and the pearl necklace she wore sat askew on her collarbone, like it no longer knew where it belonged. Whitney waited, her daughter's small hand wrapped tightly in her own, the weight of a decade pressing against her spine. Then her father stepped aside, his voice shaky but polite as he murmured, "Would you like to come in?" The house smelled the same, lemons and furniture polish with a faint trace of lavender that clung to every childhood memory like a film. The furniture hadn't changed. The ornate rug in the living room, the stiff sofa that no one ever really sat on, the framed photos in gold trim. They were all exactly where she had left them, except now they looked smaller, older, sadder. Her mother moved slowly, setting 2 glasses of water and a tiny cup of apple juice onto the coffee table with trembling hands. She didn't ask questions. She didn't smile. She just said flatly, "Please sit." Luna, ever curious, wandered toward a glass figurine on the shelf, eyes wide as she admired the tiny unicorn trapped in crystal. Before Whitney could intervene, her father knelt beside her and picked it up gently. "Your mother used to love this one," he said, handing it to Luna with a rare warmth that softened the air. "She kept it right next to her bed when she was your age." Luna beamed and hugged the unicorn like it was a treasure, and Whitney felt her throat tighten in ways she didn't expect. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was cautious, almost brittle. "We saw the article," she said, "the one in Business Insider, and the Channel 9 interview, and the gala." Whitney blinked. "You've been following me?" Her mother nodded, eyes fixed on a spot just over Whitney's shoulder. "I kept everything," she said. Her father rose and left the room, returning moments later with a thick, leather-bound scrapbook. He set it gently on the table and flipped through the pages. Clippings, printed screenshots, magazine covers, all carefully arranged. There was even a photo of Whitney on stage receiving an award, her smile broad and radiant. "I didn't know," Whitney whispered. "I thought you didn't care." Her mother's lips parted, but no words came. And maybe that silence spoke more than any apology could. Still, Whitney knew better than to confuse sentiment for change. So when Luna was ushered upstairs with a plate of cookies and cartoons, Whitney sat back down and folded her hands in her lap like a negotiator preparing for battle. "If we're going to have any kind of relationship moving forward," she began, "there have to be boundaries. Clear ones." Her father nodded slowly, but her mother's spine straightened, her jaw tightening. Whitney didn't flinch. "First," she said, "Luna will be raised to make her own choices. You will never try to shape her into who you think she should be." Her mother's eyes narrowed, but she didn't object. "Second, Andrew and I are partners. Equal. Decisions are shared. He's not in charge of me, and I'm not beneath him. If you can't respect that, we're done before we start." Her father murmured, "Of course," while her mother gave a clipped nod that barely qualified as agreement. "Third, Whitney continued, "I'm opening an office here. It's not charity, it's business. I'm offering you, Dad, a position based on your qualifications. Not an obligation. You'll be treated like any other team member, which means accountability, expectations, and no special favors." Her father's expression shifted from shame to something closer to gratitude. He sat a little taller. "I appreciate that. I won't let you down." Her mother, however, bristled. "He's not a charity case," she said, voice rising slightly. Whitney met her gaze, steel in her tone. "Neither was I, but you treated me like one." There was a pause then, long and uncomfortable. Her mother's lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat like a stone too large to swallow. Whitney didn't press. She had said what needed to be said. Whether it took root or not was no longer her responsibility. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Luna's hobbies, her preschool, and how much she resembled her father. But beneath every sentence was the undercurrent of everything unsaid, a riptide strong enough to pull them back into the past at any moment. That evening, as they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, her father touched her arm gently. "I failed you," he said, voice breaking. "I should have protected you, and I was afraid of disrupting the life we built. But I see now. I let you walk into the storm alone." Whitney's breath caught. It wasn't a full healing, but it was a first step. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means something." They left without promises, no declarations of forgiveness or dramatic embraces. Just a quiet understanding that the past couldn't be undone. But maybe, just maybe, it could be reconciled. Later, in the hotel room as Luna snuggled under the covers, Andrew looked at Whitney and asked, "How do you feel?" Whitney stood by the window, staring at the town she had once fled. "Like the ground just shifted," she said. "But I didn't fall." She turned to him, her voice softer now. "They'll never be the parents I needed, but maybe they can be the grandparents she deserves." Outside, the sky was streaked with stars. Inside, the boundaries had been drawn, not as walls, but as bridges with limits. Whitney had spent years building her life without them, and now, if they wanted to be part of it, they would have to meet her on her terms. For the first time, that possibility didn't terrify her. It empowered her. What would you have done in Whitney's shoes? Would you have gone back or kept that door forever closed? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share how this story resonated with you. Maybe you faced something similar, or maybe it's inspired you to set your boundaries. If this journey moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that they are allowed to choose freedom over tradition, share this video with them. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.